I remember the exact moment I knew it was over. Not the news broadcasts, not the first sirens, not even when the power went out for the third time in 1 week. It was a Saturday. I was standing in the kitchen making coffee, actual coffee, not that instant garbage. And my neighbor Gerald came stumbling across his lawn. Gerald was 62 years old. He wore a cardigan. He gardened. He brought us tomatoes in the summer and complained about the deer eating his lettuce. And he was dragging his own leg behind him like it was something he'd found on the sidewalk, skin peeled back to the bone, jaw working open and closed with no sound coming out, eyes flat and white as porcelain plates. I didn't scream. I didn't yell for Linda. I just stood there holding my coffee mugs and had watched him try to climb over the fence between our yards. He couldn't figure it out. Just kept pressing into it, hands gripping the wood, body leaning forward like he was trying to walk through it. That was the moment. Linda found me still standing there 20 minutes later. The coffee was cold. Gerald had given up on the fence and wandered off down the street toward the Hendersons' place. I told her what I saw. She didn't believe me at first. Nobody believes the first thing they see when the world starts cracking open. You think you're confused. You think you misread the situation. But then she looked out the window herself and saw the smoke rising from 3 different directions. And she heard the sounds. Not screaming exactly. More like a low, constant murmuring, dozens of voices all at once, none of them saying actual words. That's when she believed me. My name is David. David Keller. I'm 38 years old. Or I was 38 when this started. I've lost track enough that I'm not entirely sure what I am now. Linda is 35. We've been married for 6 years. No kids. We talked about it before all this happened. Before the world turned inside out and shook everything out like someone emptying a purse. We talked about it the way young couples talk about things they think they have time for. Someday, when the timing is right, when we're more settled. Linda wanted to wait until she finished her certification in occupational therapy. I wanted to wait until I felt less broke, which is a feeling I suspect I would have carried with me forever if forever had still been an option. Now we don't talk about it at all. There's an unspoken agreement between us that that particular door is closed. You don't bring children into something like this. You just don't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The shelter. Let me tell you about the shelter. Because that's the real story. That's the reason Linda and I are still breathing while most of the people we knew are not. I worked in construction. Residential and commercial, mostly residential. I'd been doing it for 11 years by the time the outbreak hit. Before that, I did a stint in the military, Army, 2 tours overseas, nothing glamorous. When I got out, I drifted for a while, then got into construction through a guy I served with. The point is, I know how to build things. I know how concrete works, how to pour foundations, how load-bearing walls function, how drainage systems operate. And I know how to read blueprints, which matters more than people think. About 2 years before the outbreak, 2 years before Gerald stumbled across my lawn with his leg falling off, I started a project. It wasn't planned as a survival shelter, not exactly. It started as something else entirely. Linda's uncle, a man named Roland, owned a piece of land out in the country. Not far, maybe 40 minutes from our house in the suburbs, depending on traffic. Roland was a weird guy. Quiet. Kept to himself. Had about 12 acres, mostly wooded, with a small farmhouse on the northern edge that he barely used. Roland had some money, old family money, the kind that just sits in accounts and grows slowly while the person it belongs to pretends it doesn't exist. He was generous about it too, in his own strange way, when I told him I wanted to do a project on his land, something to practice with, something to build with my own hands on weekends. He shrugged and said, "Go ahead. Use whatever part of the property you want. Just don't knock down the big oak by the creek." So I built a bunker. I didn't call it that at the time. I called it a workshop, a weekend project, something to keep my hands busy and my mind quiet. Because after 11 years in construction, I developed a kind of restlessness that only went away when I was actively making something. Linda knew about it. She thought it was a hobby like woodworking or model trains, something to keep me occupied on Saturdays when she wanted to read or go out with her friends. The design was something I'd been sketching for months before I started digging, not because I was worried about the apocalypse. I want to be clear about that. I'd seen blueprints for underground structures before, military stuff mostly, and the engineering fascinated me. How do you build something that's invisible from above? How do you make a space that can handle the weight of Earth on top of it, that won't flood, that can circulate air without an opening you can see from the surface? These were interesting problems to me. Puzzles. I dug the hole first. That took 3 weekends with a rented excavator. The site I chose was on a gentle slope in the middle of a grove of trees, far enough from the farmhouse that Roland wouldn't hear the machine running. The slope was important because it meant I could build in a way that gave me natural drainage on one side and earth cover on the other, without having to haul as much dirt. I'd planned the dimensions carefully, roughly 30 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet of ceiling height, 2 levels. The upper level would be the main living space. The lower level was for storage and mechanical systems. The concrete work took the longest. I poured the floor first, then the walls, then the ceiling in sections. I used rebar throughout. The walls were 12 inches thick. The ceiling was the same. When I was done, I covered everything with a waterproof membrane, then packed the earth back on top, graded it so water would run away from the structure, and planted grass seed. Within a month, you couldn't tell anything was there. Just a gentle mound in the woods, slightly higher than the ground around it. If you walked over it, you might notice the ground felt a little firm underfoot. That was it. The entrance was the part I was most proud of, as it wasn't a hatch in the ground, too obvious, too vulnerable. Instead, I built it into the slope itself, behind a natural rock formation that already existed on the property. The door was steel, 3 inches thick, set into a concrete frame that was flush with the hillside. I built a small wooden structure in front of it, a fake tool shed basically, with 3 walls and a roof that leaned against the hill. If you were walking through the woods, you'd see a shed. You wouldn't look behind it. You wouldn't think to look behind it. The door opened with a key and a combination lock, both of which I changed several times during construction just to practice the mechanism. The key was a standard skeleton key that I kept on my regular keychain. The combination was 4 digits. Linda's birthday. Inside, the air circulation system was the first thing I tackled after the structure itself. A sealed underground space will kill you faster than almost anything else. Stale air, carbon dioxide buildup, moisture accumulation. I installed a ventilation system that drew air from 3 different points on the surface, each one concealed. One was inside the fake tool shed. One was inside a hollow log I'd placed nearby. The third was a PVC pipe running up through the earth to the surface, disguised as a dead tree stump that I'd actually manufactured from concrete and paint. The system used a small electric fan and a series of filters. It could run on battery power if needed, but under normal conditions, it pulled from a solar panel array I'd concealed on the roof, on the earth above the shelter, I mean. These angled to catch light, but hidden under a layer of brush and dead leaves that I refreshed seasonally. The solar panels fed a battery bank. The battery bank powered the lights, the ventilation, the small refrigerator unit, and a few other electrical systems. The battery capacity was enough to run everything for about 2 weeks without any solar input. With normal sunlight, it could sustain indefinitely. I'd also installed a small propane system for heating and cooking, with a tank that held about 200 pounds of fuel. The exhaust vented through a pipe that emerged from the earth about 30 feet from the main entrance, hidden inside another fake stump. Water was the next concern. I'd tapped into a natural spring that ran beneath Roland's property. There was actually a small creek on the eastern edge of the land, and I traced its source back to a spring about 200 yards from the shelter. I ran a 1/4-inch copper pipe from the spring to the shelter, buried 3 feet underground. The water filtration system inside was simple. A series of filters that removed sediment and bacteria, plus a UV sterilization unit that ran off the battery bank. The water came out clean enough to drink without boiling, though I usually boiled it anyway out of habit. For waste, I'd installed a composting toilet system. No running water needed for that. It used a biological process to break down waste, and the output could be safely buried in the woods after processing. It wasn't pleasant work maintaining it, but it was effective. The living space on the upper level had a cot for 2, not a bed. A cot, but a decent one with a real mattress, not a pad. A small table with 2 chairs. A shelf unit running the length of one wall that I'd stocked over the course of about 8 months of weekend trips, with a genuinely impressive amount of supplies. Canned food, freeze-dried meals, rice, beans, pasta, cooking oil, salt, sugar, spices, medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, painkillers, antibiotics. I'd gotten those from a friend who was a vet. Told him I was worried about a dog bite situation, which wasn't entirely a lie since I was, in a general sense, worried about bite situations. Tools, a handsaw, a crowbar, knives, rope, duct tape, batteries, flashlights, a hand crank radio, books, a deck of cards, a small whiteboard and markers. The lower level was floor-to-ceiling shelving, mostly food storage and spare parts for the mechanical systems. I'd also put a workbench down there with a small collection of hand tools. I'd spent roughly $4,000 on the whole project, not counting my labor. Linda thought I was spending about $800 on a workshop. The rest came out of savings I kept in a separate account she didn't look at, not because I was hiding anything exactly, but because I knew if she saw the total she'd ask questions I didn't have good answers to. Why are you spending this much on a hobby? What are you actually building down there? The truth was, I didn't have a good answer. I just felt like I needed to. Like something in the back of my mind was telling me to build this thing, to stock it, to make it ready. I don't believe in premonitions or fate or any of that. But looking back, I can't explain it any other way. Something made me build that shelter. Something made me take it seriously, made me pour real thought and real money and real time into it, long before there was any reason to think I'd need it. And then Gerald came stumbling across the lawn with his leg dragging, and I needed it. The first 2 days after I saw Gerald were chaos. Not the dramatic, movie-style chaos, not explosions and military convoys and helicopter evacuations. Real chaos. The kind where nothing works the way it's supposed to, and you spend most of your time trying to figure out what's actually happening. The news was contradictory from the start. One channel was saying it was a virus. Another said it was chemical contamination from a factory spill. A third was saying it was biological terrorism and that the government was handling it. Oh, none of them were handling it. The power flickered on and off. The internet went down completely on the second day, Cell service lasted another 12 hours after that, then cut out entirely. By the end of the second day, the phones were dead and the TV was dead, and the only information we had was what we could see from our windows and hear from outside. What we could see was bad. Our street, a quiet suburban street, the kind with nice lawns and mailboxes with little flags, looked like a painting someone had left out in the rain. Cars were stopped in the middle of the road at odd angles. Doors were open on houses up and down the block. There were people outside moving, but they weren't moving the way people move. They were shuffling, drifting, bumping into things and then changing direction without any apparent reason. Some of them had injuries that should have put them on the ground permanently. Torn skin, broken bones visible through flesh. One woman 3 houses down who appeared to be missing the lower half of her face and was still walking in slow circles around a mailbox. Linda watched all of this from the upstairs bedroom window with a look on her face I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly. Something past fear. Something that happens when your brain can't quite process what it's seeing and decides to just go quiet for a while. I was moving. That was my response to what was happening. Movement. Doing things. Gathering supplies from the house, filling the bathtub with water just in case, boarding up the downstairs windows with plywood from the garage. Linda snapped out of her stillness enough to help me with that. We worked in silence mostly, in communicating in short gestures and nods. We'd been married long enough that we didn't always need words. On the morning of the 3rd day, I told Linda about the shelter. She stared at me for a long time after I finished explaining. We were sitting on the floor of our bedroom. We'd pulled the mattress off the bed and pushed it against the wall so we could sit with our backs to it, facing the door. It was a habit that had developed overnight. Always face the door, always have your back to something solid. "How long have you been working on this?" she asked. "About 1.5 years. "And you didn't think to tell me?" "I was going to. I just kept putting it off." She looked at me with an expression that, under any other circumstances, would have started an argument. Under these circumstances, it just faded into something like relief. "How much is in it?" she asked. "Enough. Food for months, maybe longer if we ration carefully. Water, medical supplies, power." "Power?" "Solar panels. Battery bank. It can run indefinitely as long as the sun is shining." She was quiet for another moment. Outside, something banged against the side of our house, not hard, just a dull thump, like someone leaning against it. We both froze. After a minute, it didn't happen again. "Okay," Linda said. "When do we go?" We left that afternoon. I'd thought about this, the leaving part, during the 1.5 years I'd been building. Not consciously, not as a plan, but I'd thought about it the way you think about contingencies when you're designing something. What if I need to get there fast? What's the fastest route? What do I need to bring that isn't already there? The drive to Roland's property took 40 minutes under normal conditions. It took us 2 hours and 15 minutes that afternoon, and it nearly killed us 3 times. The first problem was the roads. People had abandoned their cars everywhere. Not just on our street, but on every street we tried. Some of them had tried to drive through blockages and gotten stuck. Some had just stopped in the middle of the lane and gotten out and never gotten back in. We had to navigate around these obstacles constantly, sometimes pulling off the road entirely and crossing through someone's yard or a field. The second problem was the infected. They were everywhere, and they didn't seem to have any pattern to their movement except sound. That was the first thing I really understood about them. They moved toward sound. When we drove past them quietly, they often didn't notice us at all. When we hit a bump or the engine revved too loud, heads would turn. Bodies would start shuffling in our direction. Not running, never running. Just that slow, relentless drift toward the noise. This taught me something important within the first hour of driving. Noise was the enemy. I turned off the radio immediately. I drove as smoothly as I could, avoiding sudden braking or acceleration. When we had to go around an obstacle, I did it slowly. I got it carefully, like I was trying not to wake someone up. The third problem was the blockade at the intersection of County Road 7 and the highway. Someone, maybe local police, maybe just panicked civilians, had pulled cars across the road to block it. Behind the blockade, about 30 infected people were clustered together, swaying and bumping into each other like a slow-motion crowd at a concert. They were between us and the turn we needed to make. Linda saw them first. "David," she said, very quietly, and pointed. I stopped the truck about 200 yards back, engine off. We sat there for a while, watching. The infected didn't move purposefully. They just stood there or shuffled in small circles, occasionally bumping into each other and drifting apart again. None of them were looking at us. We hadn't made any noise. I had two options. Go around, find another route, which would add an unknown amount of time and distance. Or go through, drive slowly through the gap between the blockade cars, and hope the infected didn't react. I chose to go around. It added 40 minutes to the drive and took us down a dirt road I'd never been on before. But it kept us away from that cluster. Sometimes the smart choice and the brave choice are not the same thing. And I learned that lesson early. We arrived at Roland's property at dusk. The farmhouse was dark and empty. Roland wasn't there. I don't know where he was. I never found out. The entrance to the shelter was exactly where I'd left it, behind the fake tool shed, concealed and untouched. I unlocked the door with shaking hands, not from cold, from adrenaline, from the weight of what was happening. And Linda and I descended into the concrete box I'd spent a year and a half building. I pulled the door shut behind us. The lock engaged with a solid thunk. The air inside was cool and dry and still. The lights came on when I flipped the switch. A warm, steady glow from the LED panels I'd installed on the ceiling. Linda stood in the middle of the main room and looked around. At the cot, at the shelves full of food, at the small kitchen area with the propane stove and the water filtration unit, at the whiteboard on the wall where I'd written a list of maintenance tasks in dry erase marker months ago before any of this happened. She turned to me, and her face did something complicated. Relief and anger and love and exhaustion all at once, all fighting for space. "You built this for us," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I said. "I did." She crossed the room and put her arms around me and held on. We stood like that for a long time, in the quiet, in the light, underground, while the world above us continued to fall apart. When the first week was adjustment, everything felt wrong at first. The size of the space, the quality of the light, the way sounds behaved in a concrete room. Voices echoed oddly. The ventilation system made a low, constant hum that I hadn't noticed during construction, but which, in the silence of that first night, seemed almost loud. The cot was narrower than our bed at home. Linda and I lay on our sides, facing each other, close enough that I could feel her breath on my face. "How long do you think this will last?" she asked on that first night. "I don't know," I said, because I genuinely didn't. Nobody knew. The news had stopped. The radio, I had a hand-cranked shortwave radio in the shelter, picked up fragments of broadcasts, mostly static, occasionally a voice talking about evacuation routes or quarantine zones. but the information was always vague and usually contradicted by the next broadcast. Days? Weeks? I don't know, Linda. She was quiet for a while. Then, okay, we figure it out as we go. That became our mantra for the first week. Figure it out as we go. The daily routine established itself quickly, partly because routine was the only thing keeping us sane. I woke first. I'd always been the early riser in our relationship. I checked the ventilation system, checked the battery levels on the solar panel readout, checked the water filtration unit. Then I made breakfast. Usually something simple. Oatmeal with dried fruit, or crackers with peanut butter, or rehydrated eggs that tasted like cardboard but provided protein. Linda woke up slower than me, took longer to be fully present in the morning, and I'd have coffee ready for her. Real coffee from the supply I'd stocked, not instant. And she'd sit at the table with her hands wrapped around the mug and slowly come back to herself. After breakfast, we'd talk about what we'd heard on the radio overnight, about what we needed to do that day, about how we were feeling, though that last category was harder to discuss honestly at first. We were both scared. Neither of us wanted to say it directly because saying it felt like it might make it more real. So we talked around it, about practical things, about logistics, about the shelter's systems and how to maintain them. The fear was there underneath all of it, but we kept it contained, like water behind a dam. The days had a rhythm. Morning tasks, then a period of quiet in which we each did something to occupy ourselves. Linda read. I tinkered with something or other, usually a small maintenance project or an improvement to one of the shelter's systems. Lunch. Another period of quiet. Late afternoon, I'd check the radio again. Dinner, evening, sleep. It sounds peaceful when I describe it like that. It wasn't. The quiet was a different kind of heavy than silence. It was the quiet of waiting. Every so often, usually at night, we'd hear something from above. Footsteps sometimes. The sound of something brushing against the earth over our heads. Once, in the second week, a long, low moan that seemed to come from directly overhead, so close that Linda grabbed my arm, and we both held our breath for 10 minutes, not moving, barely breathing, until the sound faded and didn't come back. They were up there. We knew they were up there. Roland's property was wooded, but it wasn't isolated. There were other properties nearby, and the roads that connected them. The infected drifted. They moved toward sound. As long as we were quiet, as long as our ventilation system didn't make enough noise to attract attention, they would drift past us and keep going. The ventilation system worried me. It was quiet. I designed it that way. But it wasn't silent. On still nights, when the air outside was completely calm, I could hear it from about 20 feet away on the surface. I spent the first week monitoring this, going up to the surface through the entrance, standing outside with the door cracked open, listening. The sound was minimal, a faint mechanical whisper. I don't think anything human would have noticed it unless they were standing right next to one of the intake vents. Whether the infected would notice it was harder to judge. They seemed to respond mainly to louder sounds, voices, footsteps, things crashing. The hum of the ventilation system was below their threshold, as far as I could tell. But I modified it anyway. During the second week, I adjusted the fan speed to its lowest setting and added an additional layer of sound dampening around the motor housing using strips of foam rubber I'd packed in the supply closet. After that, the system was essentially inaudible from any distance. The airflow was slightly reduced, but still adequate for 2 people in a sealed space. Linda watched me work on these projects with a mix of gratitude and something else, something like admiration, maybe, or surprise. She'd never seen me like this before. In our regular life, I was competent, but not obsessive. I could fix things around the house, but I didn't lose myself in the fixing. Down here, though, every problem felt urgent. Every small improvement to the shelter felt like it might be the thing that kept us alive. I threw myself into the work because the alternative was sitting still. And sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the full weight of what was happening above us. Food was the first real crisis. Not immediately. We had plenty of food in the shelter, enough for months if we were careful. But the question of long-term sustainability nagged at me from the beginning. Canned goods have a shelf life. Freeze-dried meals have a shelf life. Rice and beans last longer, but even they don't last forever. At some point, we were going to need fresh food. The property had a garden. Roland's garden. A small vegetable patch behind the farmhouse that he'd maintained sporadically over the years. It was late spring when we arrived in the shelter, which meant the garden was in its early stages. Some lettuce, radishes, a few seedlings of tomatoes and peppers just coming up. It wasn't much, but it was something. The first time I went up to check on the garden, about 10 days after we moved into the shelter, I found it undisturbed. No infected near it. No sign of any activity at all on the property. The farmhouse was still dark and empty. Roland's truck was gone from the driveway. He'd taken it somewhere, presumably before or during the early days of the outbreak. The garden was just sitting there, growing quietly in the spring sunshine, completely unaware that the world had changed. I stood there for a while, looking at the rows of seedlings, and felt something I hadn't felt since we'd gone underground. Normalcy. Just for a moment. The smell of dirt, the warmth of the sun on my face, insects buzzing. It was so painfully ordinary that it made my chest tight. I brought back some lettuce that first trip. Linda ate it raw, without dressing, and said it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. We both knew that was true. After that, I started making regular trips to the garden. Always carefully. Always with my ears open, always scanning the tree line for movement. I never saw infected near the property during those early trips, but I knew they were in the area. We heard them at night, the occasional moan or shuffling footstep drifting through the woods. Roland's property was far enough from the main roads and population centers that the infected traffic was light, but it wasn't zero. The garden became important not just for food, but for morale. Linda started coming up with me after the first few weeks. She'd kneel in the dirt and tend the plants while I kept watch, and there was something almost sacred about it. This small, living thing we were nurturing in the middle of all this death. We talked more easily up there, in the open air, than we did underground. Something about the sky and the light loosened us up. I started expanding the garden too. Roland had a small shed behind the farmhouse with the seeds, tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, beans, peppers, herbs. I planted them all, following the instructions on the seed packets as best I could. Linda, who knew more about gardening than I did, helped me figure out spacing and timing. By early summer, we had a respectable vegetable patch producing food that supplemented our stored supplies significantly. We also found other food sources. Roland's property had fruit trees, 2 apple trees, and a cherry tree near the creek. The cherries came in first, a ridiculous abundance of them, and we picked them by the bucket. I learned to preserve them, clumsily at first, using mason jars and the propane stove. Linda figured out the technique faster than I did. She'd done some canning with her mother years ago and remembered the basics. We ended up with about 24 jars of preserved cherries by the end of June. The creek itself was another resource. It ran through the eastern edge of the property, and it fed by the same spring that supplied our water system. I found fish in it, small trout mostly, not huge, but enough to make a meal if you caught several. I fashioned a simple fishing rod from a branch and some line I found in Roland's shed, and spent afternoons sitting on the bank with my feet in the water, watching for bites. It was meditative, calming, the kind of activity that quieted the noise in my head. Linda joined me sometimes. We'd sit side by side on the bank, not always talking, just existing together in the afternoon light. On those days, if I closed my eyes and listened only to the water and the birds and the wind and the leaves, I could almost forget what was happening. Almost. The radio became our window to the outside world, such as it was. I tuned it every morning and every evening, scanning through frequencies, looking for any signal that might tell us something useful. For the first few weeks, the broadcasts were sporadic and contradictory. A station somewhere in the Midwest was still operating, broadcasting on a loop about a safe zone in Nebraska. But the details were vague, and the tone of the announcer suggested he wasn't entirely confident in what he was saying. Another signal, further away, was broadcasting in a language I couldn't identify. Possibly Russian, possibly something else. It repeated the same short message over and over, every hour, but I couldn't understand a word of it. Then, about a month in, I found the clearest signal yet. It was a man's voice, calm and measured, broadcasting on a shortwave frequency that I stumbled onto while scanning one evening. Or he identified himself only as the Keeper and said he was broadcasting from somewhere in the eastern part of the country. He gave no specific location. The Keeper's broadcasts were different from the other signals. He wasn't trying to give directions or coordinate evacuations. He was reporting. Observations, mostly. What he was seeing in his area. How the infected were behaving. What seemed to work and what didn't. It was like listening to a field researcher giving a report. Some of what he said confirmed things we'd already figured out. The infected moved toward sound. They didn't seem to think or plan. They just reacted to stimuli, like animals driven by instinct. They couldn't open doors or climb stairs or navigate obstacles that required any kind of problem solving. They were dangerous primarily because of their numbers and their persistence. They didn't get tired. They didn't stop. If they locked onto a sound, they would shuffle toward it indefinitely, until they reached it or something physically stopped them. Other things the Keeper said were new to us and genuinely useful. He reported that the infected seemed to be slightly more active at night. Not because they could see better in the dark, but because human survivors tended to make more noise at night, when they were moving around in the dark and bumping into things. The infected were drawn to that noise. He also reported that the infected were slowly degrading over time. Not quickly, weeks, maybe months, but their bodies were breaking down. Joints stiffening, skin falling away. Some of the older infected, the ones who'd turned in the first wave, were becoming less mobile, less capable of moving at all. He theorized that eventually, if left alone, they would simply stop moving entirely. Fall apart. That was the first piece of genuinely hopeful information we'd received. Linda and I listened to that broadcast together, sitting on the cot with the radio between us. And when the Keeper finished speaking and the frequency went to static, we looked at each other, and neither of us said anything for a long time. But hope is a fragile thing when you're underground. It doesn't stay warm for long. The first twist came on a Thursday, about 6 weeks after we moved into the shelter. I know it was a Thursday because I'd been marking days on the whiteboard with a tally system. One line for each day, a diagonal slash through every group of 5. It was compulsive, the marking. I needed to know how long we'd been down here. It felt important to track it, even though the days blurred together. I was up on the surface that morning, checking the garden and looking over the property the way I did every few days. The routine was established. Emerge from the shelter entrance carefully, stand still for a full minute listening, then move quietly through the woods, checking the perimeter before approaching the garden or the farmhouse. I'd never seen infected on the property during these checks, but I never assumed they weren't there. Complacency was the thing that killed people. I'd decided early on. Complacency and noise. That morning, I was checking the tree line on the western edge of the property when I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was a camp, not a shelter like ours, not underground, not hidden. A camp, a crude one, built in the woods about 100 yards from Roland's property line, on the other side of a low stone wall that marked the boundary. 3 tents, a fire pit, a collection of supplies stacked under a tarp, and signs of recent habitation, a water container that was half full, a jacket draped over a log, boot prints in the mud. Someone was living there. Recently. Maybe still. I stood behind a tree for a long time, watching. No movement, no sound except birds and the wind. After about 20 minutes, I retreated back to the shelter without going any closer. I told Linda about it that afternoon. Her first reaction was caution. We didn't know who these people were or whether they were safe. Her second reaction, which came after a pause, was curiosity, and we hadn't seen another living person since we'd arrived. The idea that someone was out there, nearby, alive, and apparently surviving, was significant. We debated what to do about it for the rest of that day and into the evening. The arguments for making contact were obvious. Other survivors could mean shared resources, shared information, safety in numbers. The arguments against were equally obvious. Strangers in an apocalypse were an unknown variable. They might be desperate enough to take what we had. They might be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the infected. I decided to observe before approaching. For the next 3 days, I made trips to the edge of Roland's property and watched the camp from a distance. On the second day, I saw them. 2 people, a man and a woman, both roughly our age, maybe a bit younger. The man was tall and thin, with a beard that had grown out past the point of intentional grooming. The woman was shorter, with dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. They moved around their camp with the practiced efficiency of people who had been surviving for a while, quiet, purposeful, always scanning their surroundings. They had a rifle. I saw it leaning against one of the tents while they ate dinner. A bolt-action hunting rifle, not military grade. They also had a crossbow, which the woman seemed to use more often than the man used the rifle. They were careful. Careful about noise, careful about light at night. They used a small shielded lantern that barely cast any glow beyond their immediate area. They were good survivors, or at least competent ones. On the 4th day of observation, I decided to make contact. I chose a time when they were both visible and relaxed, late afternoon, after what seemed to be their lunch. I approached from the direction they were most likely to see me coming, making just enough noise to announce my presence without startling them. I kept my hands visible and empty. No weapons. The woman saw me first. She went very still, then reached for the crossbow in one smooth motion and had it pointed at me before I'd taken 3 more steps. "Stop right there," she said. Her voice was calm but firm. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. I stopped, raised my hands a little higher. I'm not armed, I said. I live on the property next to yours. I've been watching you for a few days to make sure you are safe. The man appeared from behind one of the tents, rifle in hand, not aimed at me, but held ready. He was watching me with an expression of guarded interest. Watching us? The woman repeated. For how long? 3 days. 4, counting today. And you didn't think to say hello sooner? I wanted to make sure you weren't going to shoot me first. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. She lowered the crossbow slightly. Fair enough, she said. Their names were Tyler and Beth. Tyler was 29, Beth was 31. They'd been together before the outbreak, not married, but living together, in a town about an hour south of Roland's property. They'd survived the first days the way a lot of people had, badly and by luck. And then they'd started moving north, looking for somewhere safe to hole up. When they'd found this spot in the woods about 2 weeks before I first spotted their camp and decided to stay. They didn't know about Roland's property or the shelter. They didn't know about the spring or the creek or the garden. They were surviving on foraged food and whatever they'd managed to scavenge from abandoned houses along the way, which wasn't much. Beth had some knowledge of edible plants. She'd grown up in a rural area, and her grandmother had taught her. But they were running low on everything. I invited them to see the property. Linda met us at the edge of Roland's land, having come up from the shelter when I radioed her on the walkie-talkie I'd started carrying on surface trips. The two couples sized each other up in that awkward way strangers do when the stakes are very high and the social norms have evaporated. Oh, Tyler and Beth looked at Linda with the same careful assessment she was giving them. Then Linda looked at me, and I gave her a small nod, my way of saying I think these people are okay. And she relaxed slightly. We showed them the garden. We showed them the creek and the fruit trees. We did not, at first, show them the shelter. That came later, after we'd spent a few days getting to know them. After trust had begun. Slowly, carefully, to build. Tyler and Beth moved into the shelter with us about a week after we first met. It was a tight fit. The space had been designed for 2 people. And adding 2 more meant reorganizing everything, sharing the cot situation. We improvised a second sleeping platform using wooden planks and rope, which was less comfortable but functional, and rationing food more carefully. But it also meant we had 4 sets of hands to work with, 4 minds to solve problems, and the simple psychological comfort of not being alone anymore. Linda and Beth became close quickly. They were different in almost every way. Linda was quiet and thoughtful. Beth was more outspoken and physical. But they found a rhythm together that surprised me. They spent hours talking while they tended the garden or preserved food. And I could hear their laughter sometimes from underground, a sound that felt almost miraculous in context. Tyler and I worked well together too. He was handy, not as experienced as me, but willing to learn and quick to pick things up. We spent most of our days on the surface, working on the shelter systems, improving the garden, expanding our food production. Tyler had a calm, unsteady quality that I appreciated. He didn't panic easily, didn't catastrophize. When problems arose, he looked at them practically and figured out solutions. That was useful. For a while, maybe 2 months, things were genuinely okay. Better than okay, even. We had food, water, shelter, company. We had a routine. We had small victories to celebrate, a new crop coming in, a repair completed, a particularly good catch of trout from the creek. We had each other, but the twists kept coming. The second twist arrived in the form of Roland. It was late summer by then, August, I think, though I'd started losing precise track of the calendar and relying more on the seasons and the state of the garden for temporal reference. The days were long and hot, the kind of heat that made working outside exhausting. We'd developed a system of working in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the hottest part of the day. I was down in the shelter during one of these midday rest periods, reading a book I'd already read twice before. There weren't that many options. When Linda called down from the entrance, her voice was tight in a way that made me drop the book and move immediately. When I got to the surface, she was standing by the entrance with her hand on the crossbow. We kept weapons near the door at all times now. Staring at a man standing at the edge of the tree line about 50 yards away. Roland. He looked different. Thinner, obviously, his clothes hanging on him like they belonged to someone larger. His hair and beard were long and unkempt. But it was him. I recognized the way he stood. Slightly lopsided, one shoulder always a little higher than the other. And he recognized us too. When he saw Linda and me standing there, something in his face changed. The guarded, wary expression he'd been wearing softened into something like relief. "David," he said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Roland. Jesus, where have you been?" The story he told us over the next few hours, sitting at the kitchen table in the shelter with a cup of hot broth in his hands, was a long one. He'd left his property the morning after the outbreak started, driving north in a panic, trying to get to his sister's house in Vermont. He'd made it about 200 miles before the roads became impassable. After that, he'd been on foot, moving through the woods mostly, avoiding the infected and other survivors alike. Or he'd lived off the land. He knew how to hunt and fish and forage, skills he'd learned from his father decades ago. And he'd kept moving, always moving, because staying still felt dangerous. He'd been out there for months, alone for months. The toll it had taken was visible in more than just his appearance. He was jumpy, skittish. He flinched at sudden sounds. His eyes moved constantly, scanning, never settling. The isolation had done something to him that went deeper than physical deprivation. But he was alive, and he was back on his own property. And when I told him about the shelter, about what I'd built on his land without his knowledge, his reaction was not what I expected. He laughed, a short, dry laugh that had no humor in it. "Of course you did," he said. "Of course you built something." He didn't seem angry about it. If anything, he seemed grateful. He stayed with us after that. We made room for him, another sleeping arrangement to figure out, another mouth to feed. But we made room. Roland knew things about the land that none of us did. He knew where the best hunting spots were, where the water ran cleanest, which plants were safe to eat and which weren't. His knowledge was invaluable, and his presence on the property felt oddly right, like the place had been waiting for him to come back. Roland also brought information. He'd been out in the world for months, moving through it, observing. He told us things about the infected that we hadn't seen from our relatively sheltered position on the property. The infected were changing, he said. Slowly, but noticeably. The ones that had turned earliest were indeed degrading, falling apart, unbecoming less mobile, eventually collapsing entirely. But the newer ones, the ones that had turned more recently, were still mobile and dangerous. And there were fewer of them now than there had been in the beginning. Not dramatically fewer, but the numbers were declining. Whether that was because the virus was burning itself out or because the infected were dying off faster than new ones were being created, Roland couldn't say. But the trend was clear. He also told us about other survivors. Not nearby. He hadn't seen anyone on his travels who seemed interested in cooperation. Most of the people he'd encountered were alone, frightened and hostile. A few had tried to rob him. One had shot at him. But he'd also seen signs of organized groups, communities essentially, that had formed in the weeks and months after the outbreak. Fortified buildings, fenced areas, smoke from cooking fires. He'd observed them from a distance, but never approached, partly out of caution and partly out of a wariness that had become ingrained after months of solitary survival. "There are people out there trying to rebuild," he said. "Not many, but some." That information sat with all of us for a long time afterward. The idea that rebuilding was possible, that this wasn't necessarily the end of everything, was both comforting and destabilizing. If there was a future, we had to think about what it looked like. And that meant making decisions we'd been putting off. The third twist came in September, and it was the scariest thing that had happened to us since the outbreak began. I was on the surface alone. Tyler and Beth were in the shelter. Linda was at the creek washing clothes. Roland was checking his hunting traps in the woods to the north. It was a clear morning, cool enough to be comfortable, and I was working on a new section of fencing around the garden to keep the deer out. We'd started having a deer problem. The animals had become bold in the absence of human activity, and they were eating our crops faster than we could harvest them. I was driving a fence post into the ground with a mallet when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong, not the shuffling, moaning sound of the infected, but something else. Voices, human voices, coming from the road that ran along the southern edge of Roland's property. I dropped the mallet immediately and moved behind a tree, listening. The voices were getting closer, not trying to be quiet, talking at normal volume, or even laughing occasionally. That was wrong. Any survivor who'd been out there for more than a week knew that loud noise attracted the infected. These people were either very new to survival or very confident that there were no infected nearby, or they knew something we didn't. There were 5 of them. They came into view on the road, a narrow gravel path that connected Roland's property to the main county road about a mile to the south. 4 men and 1 woman. They were armed, not hunting rifles like Tyler's, but proper weapons. Shotguns, handguns, what looked like an AR-style rifle on one of the men. They were wearing mismatched clothing, some of it clearly scavenged. The woman was carrying a large backpack that clinked as she walked. Supplies, probably, or maybe scavenged valuables. They were moving with purpose. I'm heading north along the road, and they were talking too loudly. Much too loudly. I stayed hidden and watched them pass. They didn't look at Roland's property as they went by. Didn't seem to know it was here or didn't care. They just kept walking, northward, chattering away. About 30 seconds after they passed out of sight, I heard the first moan. It came from the south, the direction the group had come from. Then another moan, closer, and the sound of shuffling footsteps on gravel. The infected were following them. Of course they were following them. The group was making enough noise to attract every infected person within half a mile. I counted at least 8 infected passing by on the road, all drifting northward in the wake of the noisy group. 8 that I could see. There were probably more behind them, further back, drawn by the same sound. I waited until the last of the infected had passed, then moved quickly to Linda at the creek. She'd heard the voices too and was already tense, the crossbow in her hands. I told her what I'd seen. The group, the infected following them. We went back to the shelter and sealed the entrance. Tyler and Beth were inside, having heard the commotion from underground. Roland came back an hour later, having seen the infected from his position in the woods. He reported the same thing I had. At least 8, maybe 10, all moving north. We stayed sealed in the shelter for the rest of that day and through the night. The infected passed through the property but didn't linger. They were following the noise of the group, which had continued moving north. By morning, the property was quiet again. But the incident shook us, and it was a reminder that the infected were still out there, still mobile, still dangerous. And it raised a question we hadn't seriously considered before. What about other survivors? Not the friendly kind, like Tyler and Beth had been. The other kind. Roland had warned us about hostile survivors on his travels. We'd acknowledged the risk abstractly, but hadn't really planned for it. The group that passed through on the road that September morning was the first concrete reminder that the danger wasn't only from the infected. It was from people too. After that, we started posting watches. 2-person teams rotating every 4 hours, 1 person on the surface scanning the perimeter while the other stayed underground. We reinforced the shelter entrance with an additional layer of steel sheeting and installed a peephole so we could see who was outside before opening the door. Tyler rigged a simple alarm system using fishing line and tin cans, a perimeter tripwire that would make noise if anyone walked through it in the dark. It wasn't a fortress, but it was better than nothing. October brought the first real cold, and with it, a new set of problems. The shelter's heating system was propane-based, and while the tank was large, it wasn't infinite. I'd calculated early on that we could heat the shelter through 1 winter on the fuel we had, assuming moderate use. But with 5 people inside now instead of 2, and with the temperatures dropping faster than I'd expected, the consumption was higher than my calculations had suggested. I started rationing the heat. We used it at night, when the cold was worst, and during the day we layered up with blankets and sweaters instead. It was uncomfortable but manageable. The shelter's concrete walls retained some heat from the ground, and the body heat of 5 people in a small space helped too. But the nights were cold, especially in November, when the temperature outside dropped below freezing and the earth above us conducted the cold inward. Roland suggested an alternative heating source: wood. There was plenty of dead wood on the property, and Roland knew how to build a small wood-burning stove from salvaged materials. The challenge was ventilation. Burning wood inside a sealed underground space would fill it with smoke and carbon monoxide within minutes. But Roland had a solution, after he'd seen similar setups in his travels, improvised by other survivors who'd figured out the basics of underground living. We built a small stove from a metal barrel, cut in half and welded together with a fire-resistant lining inside. The exhaust pipe ran up through the earth to the surface, emerging through one of the existing ventilation holes that we modified to serve double duty. The intake air came through another vent, drawing fresh air into the shelter to replace what the fire consumed. It was crude but effective, and it produced significantly more heat than the propane system while consuming a resource that was essentially renewable. The wood stove became the center of our life underground. We gathered firewood on surface trips, cutting and splitting it by hand. Roland was fastest at this, swinging the axe with a practiced ease that belied his age, and storing it in a dry pile near the shelter entrance. The fire burned most nights, and the warmth it produced was genuinely comforting. We'd sit around it in the evenings, the 5 of us, talking or reading or just sitting in companionable silence, while the flames flickered and the shadows danced on the concrete walls. Linda loved the stove. She said it made the shelter feel less like a bunker and more like a home. I understood what she meant. There was something primal about a fire, something that connected us to a version of humanity that predated everything we'd lost. Sitting around a fire in the dark, staying warm, staying alive. It was the oldest form of survival there was. The fourth twist came in late November, and it changed everything. I was on a supply run, when we'd been expanding our scavenging radius gradually over the months, venturing further from Roland's property to check abandoned houses and stores for useful supplies. Most of what we found was junk, rotted food, broken things, nothing worth carrying back. But occasionally we'd find something valuable. A tool, a medical supply, seeds, ammunition. These trips were always done in pairs, always armed, always with a specific target and a planned route. We never lingered. We went, we looked, we took what we needed, and we came back. That day, Tyler and I had gone south, toward a small town about 3 miles from Roland's property. We'd spotted it from a hilltop weeks earlier, a cluster of buildings, some of them still standing, and what appeared to be an undisturbed hardware store on the main street. Hardware stores were gold mines for survivors. Tools, fasteners, paint, adhesives, rope, wire, all of it useful, all of it durable. We found the hardware store easily enough. The front door was smashed in, which was expected. Most storefronts had been broken into during the early chaos of the outbreak. Inside, it was dim and dusty, but largely intact. The shelves were still mostly full. Someone had picked through the obvious stuff, the flashlights, the batteries, the duct tape. But the deeper inventory was untouched. Tyler and I spent about 20 minutes filling our packs with tools and supplies, moving quietly, checking corners and doorways out of habit. We were about to leave when Tyler held up his hand. "Stop. Listen." I froze, listened. At first I heard nothing, just the ambient silence of an abandoned town on a cold day. And then I heard it too, a voice, coming from somewhere deeper in the town, maybe 2 or 3 blocks away. A single voice, talking. Not loudly, but clearly enough to make out that it was a person speaking. Tyler and I looked at each other. The decision was made without words. We were going to check it out. Not approach, necessarily. Just look, see what was there. We moved through the town carefully, staying close to the buildings, using the shadows and the abandoned cars for cover. The voice got louder as we moved north along what had been the main street. It was a man's voice, and he was talking continuously. Not to anyone that I could see, just talking. Narrating almost. Like he was giving a tour of the town to an invisible audience. We found him in a small park at the end of the street. He was sitting on a bench, almost wrapped in a heavy coat with a large backpack at his feet. He was talking to a dog. The dog was a medium-sized mutt, brown and white, with floppy ears and a tail that wagged lazily as the man talked. It was lying at his feet, looking up at him with the patient expression that dogs wear when their owners won't stop talking. The man noticed us at about the same time we noticed him. He didn't panic, didn't even stand up. He just stopped talking and looked at us with calm, intelligent eyes. "Well," he said, "company." His name was Greg Hollis. He was 44 years old, a former high school biology teacher. He'd been surviving alone with his dog, a mutt named Captain, for about 4 months, moving through the countryside, scavenging and hunting and generally staying alive through a combination of knowledge and stubbornness. Now, Greg was different from the other survivors we'd encountered. He was talkative, genuinely, enthusiastically talkative, in a way that suggested he'd been starving for conversation. He launched into a detailed account of his survival story the moment we sat down, barely pausing for breath, asking questions about our situation in between sections of his own narrative. Tyler and I listened, occasionally exchanging glances. Greg seemed harmless. More than harmless, he seemed genuinely glad to see people, and he had information. A lot of information. Greg had been traveling further than any of us. He'd covered ground across 3 states, moving through towns and cities, observing. And what he'd observed had given him a theory about the outbreak that was different from anything we'd heard on the radio or from Roland. And it's not random, he said, leaning forward on the bench with his elbows on his knees. Captain yawned at his feet. The virus, or whatever it is, it's not spreading the way they were saying on the news at the beginning. It's not airborne. It's not in the water. It spreads through bites, obviously. But there's something else going on. He paused, looking at us to see if we were following. We were. The infection rate is slowing down, he continued. Not because the virus is burning out, but because the infected are dying, breaking down, falling apart, the way your radio guy was describing. The oldest infected are already gone, completely decomposed, just bones and clothes. The newer ones are still mobile, but they're degrading. Within another 6 months, maybe a year, most of them will be non-functional. And the virus can't create new infected without living hosts to bite. And there are fewer and fewer living hosts getting bitten because the infected are becoming less capable of reaching them. So it's ending, Tyler said. Slowly, very slowly. But yes, it's ending. Greg's theory made sense to me. It aligned with what the keeper had been saying on the radio, and with what Roland had observed during his months of travel. The infected were not a permanent threat. They were a temporary one, horrifying and deadly, but finite. Given enough time and enough caution, the outbreak would burn itself out. How much time? I asked. Greg shrugged. Hard to say exactly. A year, maybe 2. Depends on how many infected are left and how fast they're degrading. But the trend is clear, and we're in the tail end of this thing. We brought Greg back to Roland's property that afternoon. It was the right call. He was alone, he had useful knowledge, and he was good company. Captain, the dog, was an unexpected bonus. We hadn't had a dog before, and the animal's presence changed the dynamic in the shelter in ways that surprised all of us. Captain was calm and quiet, a good shelter dog, as it turned out. But he also provided something none of us had thought about. An early warning system. Dogs hear and smell things humans don't. Captain would go alert, ears up, body tense, nose working, whenever there was activity outside the shelter that we couldn't detect. It saved us from at least 2 potentially dangerous situations in the weeks after he arrived. Greg fit into our group easily. He was assigned the role of teacher, essentially. He knew biology, he knew plants, he knew a surprising amount about wilderness survival for a high school teacher. He taught Beth techniques for preserving food that she hadn't known. He taught Roland, who was already a good forager, how to identify certain mushrooms that were safe to eat and which ones would kill you. He taught me, slowly and patiently, the basics of field medicine that went beyond what I'd learned in the Army, focusing on the kinds of injuries and illnesses that were most likely in our situation. Linda liked Greg immediately. She said he reminded her of a favorite teacher she'd had in college. Warm, enthusiastic, genuinely interested in the people around him. Linda had always responded well to people like that. People who made you feel like what you had to say mattered. Greg had that quality in spades. By December, we were 6 people and 1 dog, living in a concrete shelter beneath a wooded hillside in rural New England, surviving an apocalypse one day at a time. It was cramped. It was cold. It was often frightening. But it was also, in its own strange way, becoming something like a life. Winter settled in hard and fast that year. The first real snowfall came in early December, a foot overnight, which blanketed the property in white and transformed the woods into something that looked like a photograph from a magazine. Linda and I stood at the shelter entrance in the morning and watched the snow fall, and it was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. The world was ending, and it was still capable of producing beauty. That contradiction stayed with me for a long time. The snow created both problems and advantages. On the problem side, it made surface trips harder. Footprints in the snow were obvious and could attract attention from other survivors passing through the area. On the advantage side, it made infected movement slower and more visible. We could see them coming from further away, their dark forms shambling through the white landscape. And we could see that there were fewer of them than before. Greg's theory was holding up. The infected were declining. We adjusted our routines for winter. Surface trips were less frequent. We'd stocked up on firewood before the heavy snow, and the garden was dormant, so there was less reason to go outside. We spent more time underground, which meant more time in close quarters, which meant more potential for friction. And there was friction. 6 people in a space designed for 2 is a recipe for tension. No matter how well you get along, the little annoyances accumulated. Someone breathing too loudly at night, someone taking too long in the composting toilet, someone eating the last of something without telling anyone. Roland, who had spent months alone before returning to the property, struggled with the closeness. He needed space, physical and emotional, that the shelter simply couldn't provide. He started taking longer walks on the surface, even in bad weather, sometimes staying out for hours. And Linda worried about him. Tyler and Beth had their own moments. They'd been together before the outbreak, and the stress of survival had put their relationship under strain that they managed mostly by being busy, in the forced intimacy of winter in the shelter. With nowhere to go and nothing to do but sit and talk and exist in each other's presence, the strain became harder to ignore. I overheard them arguing once, late at night, voices low but sharp. I didn't catch the words, but the tone was familiar. The kind of argument that's really about something deeper than whatever triggered it. Linda heard it too. She squeezed my hand in the dark and said nothing. Greg, to his credit, was the best at handling the close quarters. He filled silences with conversation, told stories, taught little lessons about biology or history or whatever else came to mind. He was the social lubricant of the group, the person who smoothed things over when tensions rose. Captain helped too. The dog had a way of inserting himself into any conflict, nudging against legs, demanding attention, breaking the mood. And dogs are good at that. I found myself spending more time with Linda during those winter months. Not that we'd ever been anything but close. We'd been happy together before the outbreak, genuinely happy, the kind of couple that other people looked at and felt slightly envious of. But down there, in the dark and the cold and the confinement, our bond became something different. Stronger, maybe. More essential. She was the person who kept me grounded when the weight of everything threatened to crush me. I was the person who kept her practical when fear crept in and made her want to curl up and disappear. We talked at night, after the others were asleep, in whispers that the concrete walls swallowed before they could travel far. We talked about everything. The past, the present, the future. About the people we'd lost. About what we wanted, if there was a future to want things in. About fear and hope and the strange, ordinary miracle of being alive. One night in January, Linda said something that stayed with me. "I think we're going to make it, David." Not hopeful, not desperate, just a statement, delivered with a quiet confidence that was Linda's particular gift. She believed it. And because she believed it, I believed it too. The fifth twist came in February, and it nearly ended us. It was a Tuesday. I know because I'd started marking the days on the whiteboard again, more carefully this time, and I checked it that morning before going up for the daily surface check. The snow had been melting for a few days, a brief warm spell that turned the woods into a mess of mud and slush. The creek was running high and fast, swollen with snowmelt, as I went up alone that morning. Linda was sick, a cold, nothing serious, but enough to keep her in bed. The others were handling tasks inside. Tyler and Beth were reorganizing the food storage. Greg was teaching Roland something about mushroom identification using a book they'd found in the farmhouse. Captain was sleeping by the wood stove. The surface check was routine. I walked the perimeter, listening, watching. No infected. No signs of other survivors. The property was quiet in the way it usually was on mornings like this. Birds, water, wind, nothing else. I was on my way back to the shelter when I saw the tracks. Boot prints, fresh ones in the mud near the shelter entrance. Not mine. Too large, too heavy. Someone had been here. Recently. Within the last few hours, probably, given how fast the mud was drying in the morning air. I stopped and studied the tracks carefully. They came from the south, along the edge of the tree line, and they led directly to the shelter entrance, to the fake tool shed that concealed the door. The prints went up to the shed, stopped, and then came back the way they'd come. Whoever had been here had found the shed, looked at it, and then left. They hadn't found the door. The prints didn't go behind the shed. They stopped at the front of it, where someone standing there would see only the shed's exterior. A tool shed. Nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating further. But they'd been close. Very close. I went back inside and told the others. The mood shifted immediately. From the quiet, winter-bound routine we'd settled into to something tenser, more alert. Someone had been on the property. Someone had come close to the entrance and not found it. But someone had been here. We posted double watches for the next week. Tyler and Roland took the first shifts, both armed, both positioned where they could see the approach from the south where the tracks had come from. Nothing happened. No one came back. The tracks dried and eventually faded as the weather changed. But the incident left a mark on all of us. It was a reminder that we weren't alone out there, that other people knew or suspected that there were resources on Roland's property, the garden, the creek, the fruit trees. People who were desperate enough to come looking. Roland took the news particularly badly. He'd always been protective of his land, even before the outbreak. When the idea of strangers prowling his property made him angry in a way that was almost frightening to see. He wanted to set traps. Linda talked him out of it, gently but firmly, pointing out that traps could hurt us too, and that killing someone for snooping around wasn't the kind of people we wanted to be. "We don't know who it was," she said. "It could have been someone looking for food, someone desperate, someone who just needed help. And it could have been someone looking for a way to take what we have," Roland countered. "It could be," Linda admitted. "But we don't know that. And until we do, we don't kill anyone." The argument ended there, but the tension it revealed didn't go away. We were no longer sure we were safe. The shelter was hidden, but not invisible. Not to someone who was looking hard enough. March brought a change in the weather and a change in the infected. Greg had been right about the degradation. By spring, the infected we occasionally saw on the surface were noticeably worse than they'd been in the fall. Their movements were slower, more erratic. Some of them seemed barely functional, shuffling in tight circles, bumping into trees, unable to navigate even simple obstacles. The ones that had turned in the first wave of the outbreak were almost entirely gone now. reduced to collections of bones and dried skin that the animals were slowly picking apart. The newer infected were still mobile, but their numbers were clearly declining. On surface trips, we saw them less and less frequently. Some days we'd go hours without spotting a single one. It wasn't over. Greg cautioned us against complacency, and reminding us that even a few functional infected could be deadly if we were caught off guard. But the trend was unmistakable. The threat was diminishing. This realization opened up new possibilities. We started talking seriously about the future, about what came next after survival. Roland's property was good for the 5 of us and a dog, but it wasn't sustainable long-term as a community. We needed more land, more resources, access to tools and materials that weren't available in the woods. We needed to find other survivors, people who were also thinking about rebuilding, and figure out how to work together. Greg had heard rumors on the radio. He'd been monitoring it more carefully than any of us, of organized communities forming in several areas. One, about 60 miles to the east, had apparently established a functioning settlement with agriculture, basic infrastructure, and some form of governance. Another, further north, was reportedly larger but less organized. Greg wanted to find them. He wanted to make contact, see what they were doing, and potentially join or partner with one of them. The idea excited some of us and frightened others. Tyler was enthusiastic. He'd always been more adventurous than the rest of the group, and the idea of expanding beyond Roland's property appealed to his restless nature. Beth was cautious but open. Roland was skeptical. He'd seen enough of other people during his months of travel to be wary of organized groups, which in his experience were often more dangerous than the infected. Linda and I were somewhere in the middle. The idea of joining a community was appealing, and the risk of approaching strangers was real. We debated it through March and into April, and by the time the snow was fully melted and the garden was ready to plant again, we'd reached a tentative decision. We would send a scouting party, Tyler and Greg, with Captain, to find the settlement to the east and assess it. If it looked safe and promising, they would come back and we'd all go together. If it didn't, we'd stay put and keep looking. Tyler and Greg left on a Wednesday morning in mid-April, armed and provisioned for a 2-week trip. Captain trotted happily beside them, tail wagging, apparently thrilled to be going on an adventure. Linda, Beth, Roland, and I watched them go from the shelter entrance, and then we were 4 again. The 6th twist, and this one was the strangest, happened while Tyler and Greg were gone. And it was a night in late April, about a week after they'd left. I was on watch, sitting outside the shelter entrance in the dark with the crossbow across my lap, and Captain's absence making the night feel emptier than usual. The moon was up, a 3/4 moon, bright enough to cast shadows in the woods. I could see about 30 yards in every direction before the trees swallowed the light. I was scanning the tree line when I saw movement, not the shuffling, aimless movement of the infected. Something else. Something that moved with purpose and intelligence, quick, deliberate, stop and go like an animal hunting or a person trying not to be seen. I tensed, hand tightening on the crossbow. The movement was on the northern edge of the property, near the creek. It was there, then it wasn't. Then it appeared again about 10 yards closer. Whatever it was approaching. I watched it for another 2 minutes, trying to identify it. It wasn't a deer. The shape was wrong. Too low to the ground, too compact. It wasn't an infected person. The movement was too coordinated, too purposeful. It was something else. Then it stopped moving entirely, and I saw it clearly in a patch of moonlight that fell through the canopy. It was a child. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, crouching at the edge of the woods with her arms wrapped around her knees. She was staring directly at me, at the shelter entrance, at the faint glow of light that leaked through the peephole, with wide, alert eyes, not frightened, watchful, studying us the way I'd been studying her. I didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, crossbow in my lap, and looking at this child who had materialized out of the dark woods like something from a dream. After about 30 seconds, the girl stood up. She moved toward me slowly, hands visible, palms out, a gesture so deliberately non-threatening that it suggested she'd learned it from someone or figured it out on her own through trial and error. She stopped about 10 feet away and looked at me. "Are you safe?" she whispered. It was such a simple question, such a fundamental question, and I didn't know how to answer it because safe was a word that had lost most of its meaning in the world we were living in. "Yeah," I said. "I think so. Who are you? Where are you coming from?" Her name was Lily. She was 9 years old, and she was not alone. Behind her, still in the shadows of the tree line, 3 more figures emerged. 2 women and a man, all adults, all carrying packs, all looking at us with the same mixture of wariness and hope that Lily had shown. The man had a hunting knife on his belt. One of the women carried a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, crude but effective. They'd been traveling for weeks, they told me, after I'd invited them to sit down and brought out water and some of the dried fruit we'd preserved. Coming from the west, moving east, looking for somewhere safe to stop. They'd seen the light at the shelter entrance, the faint glow through the peephole, and followed it here, cautiously, over the course of several nights. They'd watched us, observed our routines, tried to determine if we were safe before revealing themselves. Lily had been the one to make first contact. She was the bravest of the group, they said, and the quietest. A natural scout, and I brought them inside. Linda woke up when she heard voices and came to the entrance, half asleep and confused, and found me standing there with 4 strangers and a child. Her expression went through several stages in rapid succession: alarm, assessment, something softening, before she settled on a calm, welcoming nod. "Come in," she said. "You must be exhausted." The newcomers were Ellen, 40, a former nurse who'd been traveling with her sister Margaret, 37, and a man named Paul, 42, who had been a mechanic before the outbreak. Lily was Ellen's daughter. Ellen's husband had been killed in the early days of the outbreak, bitten while trying to protect Lily. Ellen had been raising Lily alone since then, on the road, surviving through a combination of her medical knowledge, her stubbornness, and the help of Margaret and Paul, who had joined them about 2 months into their journey. They were thin and tired and scared, but they were alive, and they were good people. Ellen was quiet and competent, the kind of person who assessed a situation quickly and acted on what she found. Margaret was more talkative, more emotional, prone to tears that she wiped away quickly and replaced with determination. Paul was solid and steady, not much for conversation, but always willing to work. And Lily was remarkable. She had a quality that I can only describe as stillness, a deep, quiet attention that made her seem older than 9. She watched everything, absorbed everything, and spoke only when she had something worth saying. We made room for them. And it was getting crowded. 9 people and a dog in a space designed for 2. But we made it work. Roland fashioned additional sleeping platforms. Greg's food calculations, before he'd left, had accounted for potential new arrivals, and we had enough stored to sustain the larger group through the spring if we were careful. Ellen's nursing knowledge was an immediate asset. She checked everyone's health, identified a minor infection in Roland's hand that he'd been ignoring, and organized our medical supplies in a way that was actually useful. Linda and Ellen became friends quickly, the way Linda always did with people she respected. I watched them talking one afternoon, heads close together, and thought about how strange it was. This thing that kept happening, this accretion of people around Roland's property. We'd started as 2. Now we were 9. Each new person had arrived by chance, by circumstance, by the random chaos of survival. And each one had made us stronger. Tyler and Greg came back from their scouting trip in early May, and the news they brought was the best we'd heard since the outbreak began. They'd found the settlement. It was real, not a rumor, not a hopeful misinterpretation of radio signals, but an actual functioning community of about 200 people, established in a small town about 50 miles to the east. The town had been partially destroyed during the outbreak, but had been rebuilt and fortified by the survivors who'd gathered there. They had agriculture, farms on the outskirts, tended by volunteers. They had water. A river ran through the town, and they'd set up a filtration system. And they had basic electricity, solar panels, and a small wind turbine. They had medical care, organized by a group of doctors and nurses who'd survived the outbreak. They had governance, a council of elected representatives who made decisions for the community. And they had space, room for more people. They were actively welcoming survivors who wanted to join, as long as those survivors were willing to contribute to the community's survival and abide by its rules. Tyler and Greg had spent 5 days in the settlement, observing, talking to people, learning how it worked. They'd been impressed, cautiously, but genuinely. The people there were rebuilding, not just surviving, but actually rebuilding. Growing food, repairing buildings, educating children, planning for the future. It was, Tyler said, the closest thing to normal life he'd seen since the outbreak began. We should go there, he said, sitting at the table in the shelter with the rest of us gathered around. All of us. It's the best option we have. The debate that followed was shorter than I expected. Roland was still skeptical. He didn't like the idea of giving up his property, of putting himself under someone else's governance. But even he admitted that the long-term prospects of staying isolated on 12 acres were limited. Linda asked practical questions about safety, governance, and food supply, and Tyler answered them as best he could. Ellen was immediately interested. She wanted to know about the medical facilities, whether Lily could go to school. Greg was enthusiastic, as always, and talked about the biological research possibilities with an excitement that was almost infectious. Beth was the one who surprised me. She'd been quiet through most of the discussion, listening with her arms crossed. When everyone else had spoken, she said, "I think we should go. But I think we should all go together. And I think we should negotiate our terms before we commit to anything." It was the most strategic thing anyone had said all week. Beth had a sharp mind for this kind of thing, for seeing the big picture, for thinking about leverage and positioning. Tyler looked at her with something like pride, and I saw Beth give him a small smile in return. Whatever friction had existed between them over the winter seemed to have eased. We spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the move, packing what we could carry, mapping the route Tyler and Greg had taken, securing the shelter, not destroying it, but closing it up, sealing the entrance, in case we ever needed to come back. Roland spent a long afternoon in the shelter alone before we left. And when he came out, his eyes were red. He didn't say anything about it, and no one asked. We left on a Monday morning in late May. 9 people, 1 dog, 2 packs each, armed and provisioned for a week of travel. The weather was warm and clear, and the woods were green and alive with birdsong. Linda walked beside me, her hand finding mine as we moved through the trees, and I held on. The journey east took 5 days. It was not without danger. We encountered infected twice, small groups of 3 or 4, and we had to detour around them both times. And we saw signs of other survivors along the way. Abandoned camps, scavenged buildings, the occasional distant figure on a hilltop watching us pass. But no one approached us, and we didn't approach anyone. We kept moving. On the 3rd day, Lily walked beside me for a while, matching my pace with her small, quick steps. She didn't say much, she rarely did. But after about an hour of silence, she asked me a question. "David, do you think the bad people are all gone?" I considered the question seriously, the way I'd learned to do with Lily. She deserved honest answers, not comfortable ones. "No," I said. "I don't think so. There are still infected out there, and there are still people who might hurt us. But there are fewer of them than there were, and when there are more people like us, people who want to help each other, then there are people who want to cause harm." She thought about this for a while. Then she said, "Captain knows when someone is bad. He barks." "Yeah," I said, "he does. So we should listen to Captain. That's probably good advice." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to walking in silence. I glanced back at Ellen, who had been walking a few paces behind us, and saw her watching her daughter with an expression of fierce, complicated love. I understood that expression. I'd seen it on Linda's face too sometimes, when she watched the people around her, the look of someone who had found something worth protecting and was going to protect it with everything she had. We arrived at the settlement on the 5th day, in the late afternoon. The town came into view gradually. First, the outer perimeter, a fence made of chain link and wooden posts and salvaged materials, running along the edge of the town in a rough circle. Then the buildings beyond it, some of them clearly repaired and maintained. Smoke rising from chimneys, people moving along the streets. Normal-looking people doing normal-looking things. A woman hanging laundry, 2 men carrying lumber, a group of children running down the street laughing. Children running and laughing. Linda squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. At the gate, an actual gate, with an actual guard, a young man with a rifle who checked our names against a clipboard and asked us a series of questions about where we'd come from and how many infected we'd seen. We were welcomed. Not grudgingly, not with suspicion, but with genuine warmth. One of the guards smiled when he saw Captain and said, "Good dog," in a way that made Captain's tail wag furiously. We were given temporary housing, a small house on a quiet street, big enough for all of us, with actual beds and running water, cold water piped from the river filtration system, but water nonetheless. We were introduced to the settlement council, who explained the rules and the expectations. Everyone contributed. Everyone shared. Everyone followed the safety protocols. In return, everyone was fed, housed, and protected. It sounded simple. It was simple in the way that the best ideas are simple. The hard part was the doing, the daily work of maintaining a community, resolving conflicts, making decisions that affected everyone. But the structure was there. The foundation had been laid by the people who'd come before us, and all we had to do was build on it. That first night, in our new house, with actual mattresses on actual bed frames, Linda and I lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the town around us. Voices, laughter, a dog barking somewhere, a baby crying, briefly, then being soothed, the ordinary sounds of people living. "We made it," Linda said. And this time, when she said it, there was no uncertainty in her voice, no hoping, no wishing, no crossing fingers, just a simple statement of fact. We had made it. The weeks that followed were busy in a way that felt different from the busy of survival. This was the busy of building, of contributing, of being part of something larger than ourselves. I went back to work, actual work, construction work. The thing I'd been doing before the outbreak swallowed everything. The settlement needed buildings repaired, expanded, fortified. There were dozens of projects underway at any given time, and my skills were in high demand. I worked alongside other builders, men and women who'd survived the outbreak and were now channeling their energy into making this place better. It felt good. It felt necessary. It felt like the thing I was supposed to be doing. Linda found her place too. The settlement had a small medical clinic, and the occupational therapy skills she'd been working toward before the outbreak turned out to be desperately needed. People had injuries, chronic conditions, disabilities that had developed during the months of survival. Linda threw herself into helping them, working alongside Ellen and the other medical staff. Austin came home each evening tired but satisfied in a way I hadn't seen since before the outbreak. Tyler and Beth settled in quickly. Tyler found work as a mechanic. The settlement had a small fleet of vehicles that needed constant maintenance. And Beth, with her sharp, strategic mind, was invited to join one of the community planning committees. Roland took longer to adjust. He didn't like crowds, didn't like rules, didn't like being told what to do. But the settlement needed people who knew the land, who could hunt and forage and tend the farms on the outskirts, and Roland was the best at all of those things. Slowly, grudgingly, he found his niche. Greg became a teacher. There was a small school in the settlement, informal, run by volunteers, and Greg's enthusiasm for teaching made him a natural fit. He taught biology, of course, but also history, science, and anything else the students needed. Lily was one of his students, and Greg told me that she was the sharpest kid in the class, quiet, observant, and frighteningly intelligent when she decided to speak up. Captain became the settlement's unofficial mascot. He roamed the streets during the day, accepting treats from every hand he passed, and slept at our door every night, loyal as ever. The children loved him. He loved the children. It was a good arrangement. The seventh twist, and the last one, came 3 months after we arrived at the settlement. It was August again. A full year had passed since the outbreak began, give or take a few weeks. The summer was hot, the way summers are in New England, and the settlement was bustling with activity. The farms were producing well. The solar and wind power systems were generating enough electricity for the whole community. The infected sightings had dropped to almost nothing. Greg had been tracking them, and his count showed fewer than a dozen functional infected in the entire region, most of them barely mobile. I was at work one afternoon, on the roof of a building we were repairing, when one of the settlement scouts came running up the street below me, waving for attention. I climbed down to see what was going on. The scout, a young woman named Karen, fast and sharp-eyed, was out of breath and talking fast. There was something out there, she said. Not infected, not hostile survivors. Something else, a signal. A radio signal, broadcasting on a frequency that the settlement's communication team had been monitoring for weeks without picking up anything. No, it had started that morning suddenly. And it was coming from somewhere about 30 miles to the north. The settlement's radio operator, a man named Dennis, who'd been an amateur radio enthusiast before the outbreak, had been listening to the signal all day. It wasn't random noise. It was structured, deliberate, repeating the same message in a loop. And the message was in English. Dennis played the recording for us that evening in the settlement's small community hall. Everyone gathered, the council, the scouts, the medical staff, the teachers, the farmers, all of us, crowded into this room, listening. The message was brief. A man's voice, calm and professional, speaking with the measured cadence of someone who was used to being listened to. This is Dr. Alan Reeves. He's broadcasting from the National Institutes of Health Emergency Facility in Frederick, Maryland. If you can hear this message, the situation has changed. We have developed a treatment. Not a cure, a treatment. It neutralizes the virus in living hosts and renders existing infected non-functional within 72 hours of exposure. We are distributing the treatment via aerosolized delivery systems at multiple locations across the country. Distribution is ongoing. If you are a survivor and you are in need of medical assistance, or if you want to help with the distribution effort, please respond on this frequency. We are listening. We are here. You are not alone. The room was silent when the recording ended. Not the heavy, frightened silence of the shelter underground. A different kind of silence. The silence of people processing something they hadn't dared to hope for. A treatment. Not a cure, but a treatment. Something that could stop the virus. Something that could end this. Linda was beside me, and I felt her hand find mine again, the way it always did when something big was happening. Her grip was tight. I looked at her, and her eyes were bright, not with tears, though I think we were both close to that, but with something else. Something I hadn't seen in her face for a very long time. Relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. "David," she said very quietly, so only I could hear. "Yeah, it's really over." The settlement responded to Dr. Reeves's broadcast within the hour. Dennis transmitted a reply on the same frequency, identifying our location and population and requesting information about the treatment distribution. The response came back the next morning. Detailed, specific, actionable. A distribution point had already been set up about 40 miles south of us, at a former military installation. The treatment was available. All we had to do was go get it. We sent a team. Tyler led it, because Tyler was good at that. At being the person who goes out into the unknown and comes back with what's needed. Greg went with him, because Greg wanted to see the science firsthand and because he had 100 questions for Dr. Reeves that couldn't wait. Roland went too, because Roland still didn't entirely trust that this was real, and he wanted to see it with his own eyes. They were gone for 4 days. When they came back, and they brought a large case of sealed vials and a detailed set of instructions for administering the treatment. They also brought news that confirmed what Dr. Reeves had said. The treatment worked. They'd seen it in action at the distribution point. Infected individuals brought in from the surrounding area, exposed to the aerosolized treatment, and rendered completely inert within 72 hours. Not dead exactly. The bodies didn't decompose any faster than they already were, but no longer functional, no longer dangerous, no longer a threat. Ellen administered the treatment to our settlement over the course of 2 days, working with the medical team. It was simple, an aerosolized spray, released into the open air at several points around the settlement's perimeter. Anyone within range who was carrying the virus, whether symptomatic or not, would be neutralized. The treatment didn't harm healthy humans. It only targeted the virus itself. After the treatment was administered, the settlement scouts went out in force, checking the surrounding area for any remaining functional infected. They found a handful, 4 in total, within a 5-mile radius, all of them barely mobile, already degraded beyond the point of being dangerous. The treatment accelerated their decline. Within a week, there were no functional infected left in the region. It was over. not dramatically, not with a climactic battle or a triumphant moment of victory. It was over quietly, gradually, the way a storm passes, the sky clearing slowly, the wind dying down, and the rain stopping one drop at a time, until there was nothing left but silence and sunlight. The months after the treatment changed everything, and changed nothing all at once. The infected were gone. The immediate threat of survival had passed. But the world was still broken. Cities were still in ruins. Infrastructure was still damaged or destroyed. Millions of people were dead. Most of humanity, if the estimates from the government facilities were accurate. The treatment had stopped the outbreak, but it couldn't undo what the outbreak had done. What it could do was give us time. Time to rebuild. Time to think about what came next without the constant, grinding pressure of imminent death. Time to be human again, in the fullest sense of the word. The settlement grew. More survivors arrived, and drawn by word of mouth and by the radio broadcasts that spread throughout the region. By the end of that first year after the treatment, the population had doubled, then tripled. New houses were built, new farms were established, schools expanded. A library was assembled from books scavenged from houses and stores across the area. A doctor arrived, an actual doctor, not just the nurses and paramedics who'd been doing their best, and set up a proper clinic. Life, in other words. Messy and imperfect and sometimes difficult. But life. Linda and I settled into it. We acquired really, since money didn't quite mean what it used to. A small house on the edge of town, with a yard big enough for a garden. Linda planted tomatoes and peppers and herbs, the way she had at Roland's property, and the garden became her pride, and I kept building. There was always something to build, some project that needed hands and knowledge and the willingness to do hard, physical work. We didn't talk about kids, not right away. The old instinct was still there, the one we developed underground, the one that said no, not now, not in this world. But the world was changing. It was becoming safer, more stable, more like the world we'd known before. And slowly, over the course of months, the instinct began to fade. It was Linda who brought it up first. We were in the garden one evening in the fall, pulling weeds in the last of the warm weather, and she said it casually, the way she said most important things, as if it were just another thought passing through her mind. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" She pulled a weed out of the ground and shook the dirt off its roots. "About the future, about what we want it to look like." I waited. Linda always got to the point, but she had her own pace for getting there, and pushing her never worked. "I think I want a family," she said. Still casual, still pulling weeds. "Not right away, but eventually. I think I want that." I sat back on my heels and looked at her. The evening light was golden, the kind of light that makes everything look warmer than it is. Linda was kneeling in the dirt with soil under her fingernails and a streak of it across her cheek, and she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "Yeah," I said. "I think I want that too." She looked up at me then and smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful, the guarded expressions we'd worn underground, not the brave faces we'd put on during the darkest days. A real smile, full and unguarded, the kind that reaches the eyes and changes the whole face. "Okay," she said. "Good." We kept pulling weeds. The sun went down slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the garden smelled like earth and green things growing. Captain was lying on the porch behind us, watching us work with his lazy, patient eyes. Somewhere down the street, children were playing, their laughter carrying on the evening air, bright and clear and completely unself-conscious. It was, by any measure, an ordinary evening. Nothing special about it, nothing dramatic or momentous. Just two people in a garden, at the end of a long day, talking about the future. But after everything we'd been through, after the fear and the darkness and the cold and the close calls and the long nights underground listening for footsteps above us, ordinary felt like the greatest gift imaginable. I want to tell you about one more thing before I finish. One more piece of this story that I think matters, even though it doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of survival and rebuilding. About 2 months after the treatment was administered and the infected were gone, I went back to Roland's property, alone. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not Linda, not anyone. I just drove there one morning in a truck the settlement had salvaged and repaired, following the route I'd taken so many times during those first desperate months. The property looked different, and the woods had grown wilder without regular maintenance. Branches reaching across paths, underbrush thick and tangled. The garden Roland had tended was overgrown, the vegetable rows lost under weeds and wild grass. The farmhouse was still standing, but the windows were dirty and the porch sagged slightly where a support beam had given way. I walked through the woods to the shelter entrance. The fake tool shed was still there, still convincing enough to fool a casual observer. I unlocked the door. The key was still on my keychain, the combination still Linda's birthday, and descended into the concrete room where we'd spent the most important months of our lives. It was cold inside. The ventilation system had stopped working at some point. The solar panels were probably covered in leaves and debris, and the air was stale and damp. The wood stove was cold. The cot was still there, with the blankets we'd left on it, still in the shape of two bodies lying side by side. The whiteboard on the wall still had my tally marks on it, the days we'd counted out one by one, and next to the tallies, in Linda's handwriting, she'd written something I hadn't noticed before. I stepped closer and read it. We were here. We survived. We are okay. I stood there for a long time, reading these words. Not because they were profound. They weren't, really. They were simple. Plain. The kind of thing you write when you want to leave a record, a proof that you existed in a particular place at a particular time. But they meant everything. They meant that Linda had believed it, even when belief was the hardest thing in the world. Even when the evidence pointed the other way, even when the fear was so thick you could taste it. She had believed we were okay, and she had been right. I didn't erase the words. I left them there, on the whiteboard, in the shelter under the hill on Roland's property. A record. A proof. Then I locked the door and drove back to the settlement, to Linda, to the life we were building together. It's been 2 years now since the outbreak. 2 years since Gerald stumbled across the lawn with his leg dragging. 2 years since I pulled the door shut on the shelter and Linda and I stood in the quiet, underground, listening to the silence. The world is different now. Smaller in some ways, fewer people, fewer cities, fewer of the things we used to take for granted. But also bigger in other ways. More open, more possibility. The old structures, the governments, the corporations, and the systems that had organized life before were mostly gone. And what was growing up in their place was something new. Something built from the ground up by people who had survived the worst thing imaginable and decided to keep going anyway. Linda and I are expecting a baby in the spring. We found out last month, and we told the others over dinner, all of us together, the way we do most evenings now. Crowded around a table that's too small for everyone, but nobody minds. Tyler and Beth cheered. Roland smiled, actually smiled, which is rare enough to be noteworthy. Greg immediately started talking about the developmental psychology of children raised in post-apocalyptic communities, which is exactly the kind of thing Greg does. Ellen squeezed Linda's hand and said, "Congratulations," in that quiet, warm way of hers. And Lily, Anna, who was 10 now and growing up faster than any of us expected, looked at Linda with those still, watchful eyes and said, "What are you going to name it?" Linda looked at me. I looked at Linda. "We haven't decided yet," Linda said. And that's true. We haven't. There are names we've talked about. Names that feel right for different reasons. Names that honor the people we lost or the life we're building. But we haven't settled on one yet. There's no rush. We have time. Time. That's the thing we didn't have before, and that we have now. Time to breathe. Time to plan. Time to sit in the garden in the evening with the sun going down and the world quiet around us and think about the future without fear. I think about the shelter sometimes, about those months underground, in the dark, listening, like about the way the days blurred together and the way each small victory felt enormous. About the people who found us, one by one, drawn to Roland's property by chance or desperation or some invisible thread of connection. About the way we became a family. Not by blood, not by choice exactly, but by circumstance and survival and the simple, stubborn decision to keep each other alive. I think about Linda most of all. About the way she held me that first night in the shelter, in the quiet, in the light. About the way she believed, when belief was the hardest thing. About the life we're building together, here in this small town, in this broken and rebuilding world. It's not the life we planned. It's not the life we imagined when we were young, and the future seemed like an open road stretching out ahead of us. It's harder than that, you stranger, more complicated. But it's ours, and it's enough. One last thing. I want to tell you about the morning after Lily first came to us. The morning after she appeared in the woods and asked, "Are you safe?" And we brought her and her family into the shelter. I woke up early, the way I always did. Linda was still asleep, curled on her side of the cot, her breathing slow and even. The newcomers were sleeping too. Ellen and Lily on the improvised platform, Margaret and Paul on the floor with blankets we'd given them. The shelter was quiet. The wood stove had burned down to embers, and the air was cool but not cold. I checked the systems, ventilation, battery levels, water, the way I did every morning. Everything was functioning. I put a small log on the stove and watched it catch, and the flames flickering up and casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. Then I heard a sound, small, quiet, barely audible. I turned and saw Lily sitting up on her platform, awake, watching the fire with those still, dark eyes. "Can't sleep?" I asked. She shook her head. "Scared?" A pause, then a small nod. I sat down on the floor near the stove, close enough that she could see me in the firelight. "It's okay to be scared," I said. "I'm scared too sometimes." She looked at me with an expression that was too old for her face. The expression of someone who had seen things no child should see and was trying to make sense of them. "My dad used to tell me that being scared means you care about something," she said. "He said the people who aren't scared are the dangerous ones. Your dad was a smart man." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is Linda your wife?" "Yeah." "Do you love her?" "More than anything." Lily considered this. The fire crackled softly. Captain, who had come back with Tyler and Greg by this point, lifted his head from where he was sleeping near the stove, looked at us, and put his head back down. "I think love is what keeps people alive," Lily said. "Not the shelter or the food or the water. Love." I looked at this 9-year-old girl, sitting cross-legged by a wood stove in an underground bunker at the end of the world, and I thought she might be the wisest person I'd ever met. "Yeah," I said. "I think you might be right about that." She smiled, a real smile, wide and bright, and the kind of smile that children have before the world teaches them to be careful with it. And then she lay back down and closed her eyes. I sat by the fire for a long time after that, listening to the breathing of the people around me, watching the flames, thinking about what Lily had said. Love is what keeps people alive, not the shelter, not the solar panels or the water filtration or the composting toilet or the carefully rationed food, not the crossbow or the tripwire or the peephole in the door. All of those things helped. All of them mattered. But they weren't the thing that actually kept us going, day after day, through the fear and the cold and the darkness. The thing that kept us going was each other. Linda and me, Tyler and Beth. Roland finding his way home. Greg and his dog and his endless curiosity. Ellen and Margaret and Paul and Lily appearing out of the woods like gifts we didn't know we needed. The thing that kept us going was the decision, made over and over again, every single day, to stay alive. Not just for ourselves, but for the people beside us, for the people who needed us, for the future that was still possible, even when it didn't look like it. That's the story. That's all of it. A man built a shelter. The world ended. He and his wife went underground. And then, one by one, they found each other. The lost ones, the scared ones, the ones who were still willing to fight for something worth fighting for. And they survived. And they're still here. And the morning light is coming through the window now, pale gold and warm. And Linda is making coffee in the kitchen, and Captain is scratching at the back door to be let out, and somewhere down the street, a child is laughing, and the garden needs watering, and the day is starting, and we are alive, and it is enough. Thanks for watching, guys. I will be back with another story.